Hi, I'm Sonia Gensler, and this is my first book, The Revenant, which is set in Oklahoma. It is a ghost story set at a Cherokee boarding school in northeastern Oklahoma in Tahlequah, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And it is still today the capital of the Cherokee Nation. And the school in this book was a real school that is now part of Northeastern State University. The building has become kind of their centerpiece. I've always been interested in boarding schools because they're such great settings for drama. You know how dramatic it is at school every day, but imagine if you didn't get to go home at night. If you spent the night in that school, imagine how the drama might continue between your friends and your enemies, with your teachers. All that makes for really good stories. And if you added a ghost into that, if you added a haunting into that, you'd have quite a story, and that's what I wanted to write about in The Revenant. A lot of people have asked me how I got published, and it's kind of a long story. It took a long time. It took a few failures before I got published. The Revenant is the third manuscript I completed. And I would say to anybody who's interested in publishing that the first thing you need to do is to finish a story. I talk to so many writers who get bogged down and give up on projects and start new projects without ever actually finishing something. So that's my number one piece of advice, is to stick with a story and finish it. My first story that I finished, I decided I wanted to try to find an agent first. An agent can help you find a publisher, can kind of matchmake your book with the right editor, with the right publishing house. And I tried to find an agent for my first book, and I talked to a few agents who seemed interested, but nothing really happened. And at that point, I could have given up, because it is disheartening to be rejected. But I decided, okay, time to put that aside. I'm going to write another novel. I've learned a lot over the course of trying to find an agent. I'm going to write a better book. And I think I did write a better book. And I did have agents who were interested in it. In fact, one agent I signed with because she liked the book so much. And she tried to matchmake with the publishing houses that would be interested in it. But as hard as we both worked, that book didn't sell either. So I was very disappointed in myself. I felt like my agent might not want to stick with me if I couldn't sell a book for her. So I decided to write my third book, and that was The Revenant. And I will tell you that I wrote the first draft of this book in 2008 for something called National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, it's also known as. And it's a thing where people all over the world kind of band together and communicate online and sometimes even in person to write 50,000 words in 1 month. And that's about 1,700 words a day, almost 1,700 words a day. And that kind of pressure worked for me. And I completed the first draft within the month. And then I revised over the next few months. So that was November of 2008, and we had sold the book by the end of April 2009. That's the fastest I've ever turned a book around like that. I don't know if I recommend working that fast, but it worked that time for me. And that led into my second book. So I told you how I felt kind of pressured to write The Revenant quickly. I was afraid my agent was going to break up with me, which I don't think she would have done, but I was afraid of that. My editor is the kind of person who likes to take her time working on a manuscript, so I ended up having quite a bit more time to write my second book. And my second book actually came out of some of the research I did for The Revenant. I read this really great book called Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has written on so many different topics. She has a book called The Poisoner's Handbook, which is basically about early 20th century forensic science. This was an earlier book that was about early paranormal researchers, basically. People in the 19th century who were respected academics, respected scientists, were just sort of wealthy, respected people who all shared an interest in the afterlife or paranormal abilities like telepathy and telekinesis and things like that. They thought that the scientific community was not taking these issues seriously enough. And they were willing to put their expertise and their money behind studying things like mediums, spiritualism, communication with the dead, but also, like I said, telepathy, being able to read somebody's mind, or possibly being able to move things with your mind. And they got a lot of flack for it, but they continued to pursue their research. And I just kind of came across this book by accident while researching The Revenant, and not much of this ended up in The Revenant. It all seemed like material for a different story. These people, they were all grown people and they had really interesting lives. The book is a nonfiction book, but it read like a novel to me, and I thought, wouldn't this make a great, like a miniseries for HBO? Because these people were so interesting, and they did some crazy stuff too. But I didn't want to write a miniseries for HBO. I like to write about teenagers, so I started imagining what if these people had had kids, and what if these kids were kind of embarrassed by what they did, because they did get a lot of criticism. And then what if these kids, what if one of the children actually did have one of these abilities that the parents were all so desperately trying to prove or to get data on, and yet she didn't want to share that because she didn't want it to be exposed to the world. And that gave me the idea for my second book, and this is the advanced copy that's in paperback, but it will be out in hardcover in August 27th of 2013. Gave me the idea for this book, The Dark Between, which is set in Cambridge, England, at a college for women, kind of like the school for women in The Revenant, and is about 3 teenagers who by chance end up together and using the paranormal abilities of one of the members of the group try to solve a murder. They try to catch a killer. But first they have to convince her to use her abilities, which she's reluctant to do. And they have to convince themselves that this is really possible to communicate with the dead, because they're not all sure of this at the beginning of the story. And the cool thing about this book was that the research took me overseas, and I've been to Cambridge 3 times now. I'm going to go again this summer to try to get some more footage. It's a beautiful university town. Oxford and Cambridge are the big university towns in England, and they're ancient. I think Cambridge dates back to the 1200s possibly. And it's a beautiful setting, a historic setting, but it's still a thriving university today, so it feels modern at the same time. But a great place for a story. Well, I thought I would show you around my office where I do my writing and my research, but I have to warn you that it's a bit messy, and actually this is one of the clean days, so imagine what it's like on a really crazy day. But I started in this room with maybe 2 bookcases, and now every wall is basically full of bookcases, and they're all overflowing. But I could show you how I tried to arrange it. I do have what I call my classics in the top 3 shelves of these 2 bookcases, so I can always go to my Jane Austen or my Charlotte Bronte or my Dickens or my Dickinson, all the way down to when you get to college, you'll probably get the Norton Anthology of Literature at some point when you're doing your English classes. Remember that book that didn't sell? Here were my research books for that. It was set on a plantation in Tennessee, and so I had all sorts of books about Southern women in the 19th century and living on a plantation and that sort of thing. Over here, the second book I wrote that didn't sell, all my books for that. It was set in England during Arthurian times, and it was a minor character from Arthurian legend named Elaine, and I still hope that maybe one day I could revise that book and it might sell. I haven't given up on that one yet. So there's all my King Arthur fiction below, and then over here is I have lots of books from when I was a teacher, my Shakespeare and my poetry. I have pictures of my family here. This is my grandmother, who was a teacher for many years. She's now 95. She's still living. She still loves to read. Books that I'm intending to read. And then all my writing books. I collect a lot of books about writing as well. And I'll tell you what, the one that everybody always mentions that you have to read if you want to be a writer is Stephen King's On Writing. And here's my true confession. I haven't read it yet. Everybody says, read this book, and I've had it forever, and I still haven't read it. So that's on my homework list. Most of these I have read most of. Okay, and then if we switch over to the other side, and I'll talk about this in a minute, I'm not going to talk about that yet. I write young adult fiction, so I have a whole area where I collect my young adult books, and you can tell that I'm already growing out of my space. And I can't even bear the thought of culling any of these books, but something's going to have to be done. So these are the ones that I've read and loved. Trying to think if there's one in particular that I could point out to you, but I just love them all. So, and of course I keep copies of my own down there as well. And then here's my desk for working, which is usually piled with papers and other books, and you know, my computer is right here. And I decided that, pardon the mess here, that I would keep the books for my the research books for my current writing project near me. And so these were the books that I used for The Dark Between. So there's books about Cambridge, there's books about particular colleges at Cambridge, because Cambridge is not one single university. Cambridge University is made up of about 40 colleges, so lots of different colleges within that have their own identities. And then these are the books that I'm also still planning to read, and they're piling up with more as well. So I'm kind of a book hoarder, in case you haven't noticed. And then I'm going to share with you my writing partner, but he ran away from me. Come here, kitty. Come here. Here he is. Here's my kitty child, who's almost always sitting in my lap while I'm writing. That's where he seems to think he belongs. So this is Cedric. Hello. And that's my office. Okay, I'm going to put the cat down and show you that board that I gestured at before, because it's another writing tip, something that's helped me organize my story that I'm working on right now. Now, there you go. So if you'll follow me back over, a lot of people use graphic organizers. Some people are able to arrange this sort of thing on the computer. There's a program called Scrivener that has a virtual corkboard that you can do this and keep it all on your computer. It'll be portable that way. But I like to have something that's separate from my computer so that I can look back and forth between. And I've always been a fan of planning my story ahead of time, of outlining. Not everybody's that way. Some people just like to start the story and write it until it's done. But I like to plan because it seems to make it easier to continue during the middle of the story, which is always the hardest for me and for a lot of other writers. I borrowed this idea from a screenwriter book called Save the Cat. Isn't that funny? Because I just showed you my cat. But the book is by Blake Snyder. It's called Save the Cat. And he recommends charting your story out and then creating kind of a storyboard. And each of these cards is a scene in the story. And this is the end of the first act, which he calls Break into Two. This is free advertising for Blake Snyder, by the way. This is the midpoint of the story. This is the second act. This is the second act, and it's the break into the third act. And then we have the final act of the story, kind of like a play. You'll notice that once it gets down to the final act of my story, it gets a little sketchier on the cards. There's a lot more detail up here because I know pretty much what's going on here, but once it gets to the end, I almost have to get there before I get more specific in the detail. But this helps me. I also can put little notes when I have, you know, you think, oh, I bet I could add a little something. You can put a little post-it, come back to that later. It's a good place to just organize your ideas, and then the computer is for actually typing out the story. And I had a lot of fun with it. So it's almost like play to put this together, but it's also work. I really want to thank you for coming by today and visiting me in my office. And I want to thank OCAI for including me in their activities and on their website. And you can find out more about me on their website. You can also go to my personal website, which is soniagensler.com. And I want you to know that I really love to come to schools. I did teach for 10 years, and I miss the time in the classroom. It was just impossible. Lots of people can teach and write at the same time, but I couldn't quite manage it. So now I like to do school visits to reconnect with students and teachers and librarians. I could tell you a little bit about the kind of things I like to do. I have visited middle school and high school. I have given presentations on, you know, frequently asked questions that writers get. I've done presentations on tips for people who want to become better writers or who want to write professionally. I have lessons on planning a story. I have lessons on, you know, improving your dialogue and specific things like that. I, you know, have visited schools for a day. I've visited schools for half a day or even one session. So I'm very flexible, and I want to work with you because I know schools have so much to do each day, so much to pack into their school year, and, you know, funding is always an issue. So you can always contact me through my website. My email address is there, or you can contact me through OCAI. And I hope to see you.